are the implications for grassroots economics? Well, if peer production is bringing this renewed focus on innovation, creation, and collaboration, with an emphasis on collective knowledge and collective knowledge over static information, how will this be facilitated in an age of standards and managed curriculum? How can we integrate this concept of peer production and innovation when we are in a very serious kind of limiting standards era? A new generation of youth are bringing a new ethic of openness and participation. They expect to create, they expect to produce. How are we going to teach these students, and how are we going to include them as contributing participants? The next driver that we have is smart networking. And smart networking basically is part of the participation model, but it goes beyond changes in the economy. It actually talks about changes in our personal life now. People want to self-organize to produce shared experience. So when the web came out, in the 80s and, really took off in the 90s, basically people started talking about the information age. We live in the information age. You can get anything, anywhere, anytime. And that's pretty much how I use the web. You just surf the web and you can read and you can watch videos, you can listen to audios, and you can learn. But it's actually a very passive act that I'm doing. Today's web is about the connected age, not the information age. And this is basically where people connect with each other over loose, online communities. So online communities are created everywhere, and people are connecting over them for the purpose of shared experience and self-organizing. A couple mental models here that many of you are probably familiar with is MySpace. And that has certainly made the news a lot lately, but this started as a very small social networking website that has grown to be quite huge. Many of you have probably heard of Facebook. Facebook is still predominantly used. I see the college student over there nodding her head. I remember when I was at Dean of Williams College, freshmen would walk in with their Facebooks, and they're quite hard copies with black and white pictures, and they're able to identify their dorm mates and the people in the class by walking around with this Facebook. Well, someone turned the concept of Facebook into a social networking website. And though it has been expanded beyond college, it is still used beyond college. So these are websites where people come purely to cross geographic boundaries, no real purpose except to interact with one another. Another example that some of you may be aware of is Meetup. Meetup is basically an online space where you go to meet people in your local area over shared interests. You can just go on there, put in your zip code, put in your interest, and you can find other people to meet. So this is the issue of self-organizing to create shared purposes. However, the great thing about these websites, because there are some things that wouldn't be, is that you can use these websites for more purposeful action. So while MySpace.com is vilified for many different reasons, it has also become a social action network for youth. So last year, some of you might remember when a walkout was staged in LA against the immigration legislation that was pending. This was all organized on MySpace. Meetup was a social network for adults, but when the presidential elections from the last term came around, Howard Dean supporters used Meetup and set record number of fundraising goals by using Meetup. Facebook is used on college campus for collective organizing all the time, as well as people running for offices within the campus. So a lot of these social networks have turned now into more of a collective action network as well, so they could be used for either. You also have activist networks. Many of us remember MoveOn.org. It started as a website that simply told Congress, hey, let's move on. Let's end these impeachment proceedings against President Clinton and let's move on. Well, now MoveOn has turned into a place that mobilizes voters on multiple issues. This last election, you could get text messages from MoveOn if they thought there were voting improprieties taking place. And then they give you a number to call in and say, hey, there's voting improprieties taking place over at this precinct. I want somebody to go investigate. So essentially, these networks are being used to mobilize people. Have anybody heard of grassfire.org? This was a grassroots internet-based group that derailed immigration legislation a couple weeks ago by 15 votes. They were able to get $700,000 petitioned simply by mobilizing people over the internet. They had people call their congressmen and senators, they had people send in emails, and they had people sign elections. And the power of that was that a vote was derailed by 15 votes because of this group. So one of the questions that, the implications here for education is imagine students, parents, teachers, communities as smart mobs. Basically people who are developing their collective intelligence and creating collective action. What collective action will teachers and students and parents take in response to education and teaching learning? Again, youth are going to bring this interactive and meaningful participation ethos into everyday life. So what are the possibilities for learning that connectedness brings? Many schools and districts are really struggling by not having students use MySpace from their computers at school for various reasons, dealing with predators and different issues. But kids want to connect online. So how is that facilitated in learning and facilitated in a school? Now, the next slide is really exactly what it says. If I did say anything else, I wouldn't have to. Strong opinions, strongly held. If you look at the pictures on this slide, we're really talking about the dualistic arguments, okay? Creationism, evolution, animal rights. And what we're seeing, and this is when some of that bad news comes in, so I can depress you as well with Tom, is that we're really seeing this polarization around strong opinions, strongly held. And how we're seeing this play out is in subcultures, actually. People are identifying by multiple identities. And we've seen this, happen with regard to race, ethnicity, gender, and religion, that people are identifying more and more by their different identities. I was at a presentation at the Grantmakers for Education where Richard Rodriguez spoke, and many of you have heard of him. He works for PBS, and he wrote the book, The Hunger of My Memory. And he has a lot to say about multiple identities, very controversial. But his point at this group was that he went to high school one day, and he was there over the lunch hour, and he saw all these different kids divide by clubs that focused on some element of their identity, most often ethnicity. And he looked around and he saw the, cafeteria split up with all these different clubs based on different forms of identity, and he wondered, well, where's the common ground? Where do they come for commonality if they're so busy differentiating themselves? We were at an awards ceremony for President Clinton recently in Cincinnati, and he talked about the fact that the Human Genome Project has learned that our DNA is 99.9% the same, that all of us share 99.9% of the same DNA, but we spend all the time differentiating ourselves on that 0.1%. So this is about strong opinions strongly held, showing up in how we identify with each other, showing up in different subcultures. And with some of the different drivers I just talked about, with smart networking and with the grassroots economics, you can actually further isolate yourselves or validate your opinions. So let's take grassfire.org or let's take moveon.org, is that validates certain opinions that I have, and I'm able to mobilize around that. So, so we have to think about how do we actually create bridges now around these issues. The other way that people are identifying now is becoming a little more fine-tuned. Some people identify with health relation. So I'm a cancer survivor. People wearing the bracelets that Lance Armstrong did when he did this bike race. People are starting to identify based on their DNA code and their DNA histories. People are starting to identify by family makeup. I come from a single-parent family. I come from an intergenerational family. I come from a single-sex family. People are finding different layers by which they identify now. And so the implications for education is how can education build bridges across these extremely polarizing differences? So this was actually a quote from Thomas Friedman: "The world is flat, but is increasingly marked by great gulfs that separate the people who live within that." So what is the role of education here? As people identify themselves and affiliate by specific attributes, they're also going to start rejecting mass offerings. We see more of a desire for personalization. People want to customize, like the big thing about the Mini Cooper, besides the fact that it's a cute little car, is that you can actually go to the website and you can actually customly design your own Mini Cooper, and that's partly why that car is so popular. How is teaching and learning going to respond to this desire for deep personalization? And I told you we were taking a turn for a little bit more of the sad kind of future forces that are taking effect. Well, one of the drivers is called sick herd. And really where that term comes from is it comes from it's an ecologist term. And it basically means when the environment is not able to sustain a population. And so that is the term that was applied to this driver. And this driver really is about compromised health and chronic illness, okay? So the environment accounts for 20% of our health. If we are starting to have the effects of global warming, or if we are not able to have sufficient resources from an environment, how is that going to affect our health?